They buried Marcus in a casket of polished oak, lined with roses that smelled sweeter than the truth. Guests filled the pews with bowed heads, whispering prayers, pretending grief. But I wasn't watching the coffin. I was watching her. Evelyn, his stepmother. Her hands clutched her pearls as if they were rosary beads, her mouth quivering with false sorrow. Every tear she shed was a lie, and every glance in my direction was a blade. I stood at the front, his wife, the woman he vowed to love until death. But even here in the church where they laid him to rest, I was treated like an intruder. Whispers slid across the room, voices hissing behind veils. She doesn't belong here. She'll get nothing. He left it all to the family. And then, before the final hymn had ended, Evelyn moved. She rose from her pew, her heels striking the marble like the toll of a bell. She turned to the crowd, voice sharp, trembling with performance, and in front of every mourner, every guest, she pointed at me. "Out!" she said. "This is no place for you. You were never truly one of us." The ushers hesitated, but her glare was enough. Their hands touched my arms, pressing me toward the door, past the coffin of the man I once believed would protect me forever. Laughter hid behind veils, eyes widened, whispers thickened, and as the doors of the church closed behind me, I understood. Evelyn thought she had won. She thought grief would shatter me. She thought being cast out would end my place in this story. But she was wrong, because while they lowered Marcus into the earth, while Evelyn celebrated my humiliation, I wasn't breaking, I wasn't weeping, I was waiting, and when I returned, I wouldn't come as the broken widow they pitied. I would come as the reckoning they never saw coming. Before I reveal how I turned humiliation into power, subscribe right now. If you don't, imagine being thrown out of your own husband's funeral with nothing and no one. Comment where you're watching from. I'll see who speaks boldly and who hides in silence. They remembered me that day as the widow who was pushed from the church, but few remembered how it began, how a woman like me, Naomi, ever stood at the altar beside a man like Marcus. I wasn't born into wealth. My life began in crowded apartments, the hum of ceiling fans, the smell of ironed uniforms waiting for hospital shifts. I worked long nights as a nurse, patching together lives with steady hands, while quietly patching my own heart with endurance. I was not fragile, but I was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of pouring out care while no one poured anything back into me. It was at a hospital fundraiser that Marcus first noticed me, a man dressed in tailored black, his cufflinks catching the light like they belonged to another world. His world. His laugh carried across the room, practiced yet genuine, drawing people to him. But his eyes kept finding me. I had gone there only to help, serving drinks, checking on the elderly donors. Yet when he approached, when he asked for my name, it was as if I had been pulled out of the background and set into the center of the frame. Naomi. For the first time, my name was spoken like it meant something. He courted me quickly. Dinner reservations at places I had only read about. Flowers delivered to the hospital reception desk, leaving my colleagues whispering and staring. He was direct, persuasive, and he made me believe that fate had finally remembered me. Our dating days felt like a story written in fast ink. A weekend away at the coast, where the sea salt clung to my hair as he spoke about dreams bigger than cities. A winter evening when he took my hand in a public square, pulling me close beneath the lights, whispering that the world could collapse and he would still hold me. When he proposed, it was with the precision of a man who knew how to win. A rooftop garden, strings of golden lights, a velvet box held in hands that had closed countless business deals but now trembled for my answer. I said yes. How could I not? The wedding was everything I never dared to dream. Guests in shimmering gowns, cameras flashing, music swelling as I walked down the aisle in silk that seemed to float. I remember the way Marcus looked at me, like a man claiming victory, but also like a man opening a door to a kingdom he was proud to share. In that moment, I believed I was safe. I believed I was chosen. But fairy tales have a cruel habit of blinding you with beauty before cutting you with truth. And while I smiled at the vows, while I kissed the man everyone envied, I never saw the shadow standing among the guests that day. Evelyn, his stepmother. Her smile was thin, her eyes sharp, and though she clapped with the rest of them, her heart did not bless the union. Even then, before I knew her schemes, before the whispers and the humiliation, I felt her stare, a chill in the middle of warmth. And though I walked from that wedding hand in hand with my new husband, I could not know that another woman had already decided I didn't belong in his life, that my story, no matter how beautiful it began, would one day be dragged into the darkness of her making. Our marriage was celebrated as the union of strength and grace. Marcus, the self-made developer with towering projects and an empire in motion, and me, Naomi, the nurse who once counted every dollar, now stepping into a world of polished floors and endless glass windows. The first months were a blur of luxury I could scarcely comprehend. Keys placed in my palm for a penthouse overlooking the skyline, cars waiting in the garage, their engines humming like beasts under control, vacations planned with precision, private beaches, quiet mountain retreats, places where silence was bought and beauty seemed endless. But beyond the gifts and the glitter, there was something else. I discovered that Marcus was ambitious, yes, but careless in his execution. He spoke boldly, closed deals quickly, yet often left loose ends hanging. Where he thrived in vision, I thrived in detail. Where he built castles in the air, I laid foundations under his feet. It began with small things, organizing files he left scattered across his desk, reminding him of deadlines his assistants had overlooked. Then it became larger, helping him reshape presentations, drafting letters to investors, running numbers late into the night while he slept. Without realizing it, I was becoming the strategist behind the curtain, the quiet force steadying the storm. Soon, Marcus was praised not just as a leader, but as a visionary. He was interviewed in magazines, featured on business panels, hailed as a man who saw the future before others could. And every time his face appeared on the cover, I smiled silently, because I knew the numbers that kept his empire balanced had been checked by my eyes. The deals that kept his projects alive had been rehearsed at our dinner table. The speeches that moved investors had been shaped by my words. We became a team, though few could see it. He was the crown. I was the invisible jewel keeping it fixed upon his head. But wealth does not exist in silence. Luxury has a way of drawing not only admirers, but eyes filled with greed. And while we rose higher, whispers began to follow us. Rumors of associates waiting for Marcus to stumble. Rivals circling our projects. And Evelyn, his stepmother, never far from view, always close enough to remind me with a glance that I had stepped into a world she did not welcome me to share. At charity galas, she would lean close to strangers, whispering with a smile as her eyes flicked in my direction. At family dinners, she carved words with the precision of a knife. Marcus has done well for himself. It's important he keeps it all in the family. I swallowed those words with quiet grace, knowing what she meant. To her, I was never family. I was a guest wearing borrowed jewels, a shadow in the kingdom she thought belonged to her blood. But Marcus dismissed it. He told me Evelyn could be cold, but she was still family. He said her words meant nothing, and I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that love was stronger than envy, that our empire was safe. Yet deep down I began to understand. Success does not only attract admirers, it attracts poison. And sometimes poison doesn't strike quickly. It waits. It lingers. It seeps through the cracks until the walls you built begin to tremble. In every grand house, shadows gather in the corners, no matter how high the ceilings rise. Ours was no different. While the world applauded Marcus as a man of power and whispered admiration followed me as his wife, something unsettled began to shift within our walls. It started with Evelyn's presence. She was everywhere, though she owned nothing of what we built. She arrived uninvited to dinners, criticized the staff with a smile, and walked through our home as though it was hers. She had a way of standing in doorways too long, as if measuring what she believed would one day belong to her. Her words were always sweetened with honey, but her tone dripped with contempt. At the table she would lean forward, her fork resting in her hand, and remark, "Marcus, you mustn't let outsiders decide what's best for you. Family must remain in control." Her eyes always fell on me when she said it. Outsider. That was her name for me. I tried to dismiss her. I told myself she was only protecting what she thought was hers. But then Marcus began to change. He laughed less, worked later, and carried his phone with him everywhere. Calls were cut short when I entered the room. Papers disappeared from his desk the moment I stepped closer. At first, I doubted myself. I had seen exhaustion in nurses I worked beside, people growing distant not from betrayal, but from the weight of too much on their shoulders. I told myself it was stress. That business consumed him, that love could still anchor us. But Evelyn fed his doubts. I could hear it in the tone of his voice when he spoke to me. He would ask, "Do you understand how complicated these deals are? Do you know how much pressure I'm under?" As if the woman who had balanced his ledgers, reviewed his contracts, and whispered solutions into his ear had suddenly become incapable. Her poison was subtle, but steady, a drip at a time. And soon I found myself journaling at night, writing words I was too afraid to speak. Words about distance, about secrets, about the growing fear that the man whose empire I had helped build was slipping away from me. I told myself it was only fear speaking, but fear is rarely wrong. It is the warning before the storm. And one evening, as I closed my journal and set down my pen, I felt it deep within me. The man I built an empire with was about to tear it all down, with one message. Do you believe you could see betrayal before it reached you? You couldn't. Subscribe now, and tell me where you're watching from. If you don't act surprised when the very person sleeping beside you is already plotting your downfall. The night it happened, nothing appeared unusual at first. Marcus had left his jacket on the arm of the sofa, his glass of wine half finished on the counter, his phone resting face down on the edge of the table. He told me he was stepping into his study to finish a call. I nodded, smiled, and pretended to believe him. But something in the air told me to stay still, to wait. I sat quietly, listening to the low murmur of his voice from the next room, too muffled to hear the words, yet sharp enough to feel the distance. The glass of wine before me remained untouched, the second hand of the clock moving slower than usual, dragging me toward the truth I wasn't sure I was ready to see. When the call ended, I heard the soft click of his door closing. His footsteps moved down the hallway, his voice humming lightly as if nothing weighed upon him. But he had left his phone behind. It was a small mistake, a careless one, and in that carelessness, the world I knew ended. I picked it up slowly, as though the weight of it could burn me. The screen lit at my touch, and there it was. A single message flashing across the top. A name. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, his stepmother, my enemy, and beneath her name, the words that shattered everything. Remember, she cannot know. Transfer it tomorrow. Candace is ready. At first my chest tightened, as if the air had been pulled from the room. My pulse thundered in my ears. I scrolled down, my hands trembling, and the rest appeared. Messages too intimate, too reckless to deny. Conversations not of mother and son, but of conspirators planning in shadows. Pictures sent, hotel confirmations, notes of where and when. And then another name repeated again and again, Candace. A woman I had never met, but a woman who was being prepared to replace me. The room began to blur as the truth pressed into my bones. Marcus had betrayed me. Evelyn had orchestrated it, and together they had written me out of the story I helped build. I could have wept until my body gave way. I could have screamed into the silence of that night. But instead, I stood in the middle of that room with the phone still glowing in my hand, and I made a choice. I buried my tears. I buried the softness that had once made me easy to wound. And in its place, I dug up something far heavier: my rage. After that night, Naomi's world no longer carried the softness of grief. It carried the steel edge of revelation. She had uncovered the rot beneath the polished smiles, the whispers between Marcus and Evelyn, and the shadowy presence of Candace. But fury alone would not save her. Fury alone could not win a war against enemies who moved with precision. No, Naomi needed evidence, proof, something solid enough to cut through the lies and expose what was hidden. So she sought out someone who lived in the shadows, not out of choice, but profession. His name was Raymond Cole, a man once known as a private investigator for the wealthy, a man whose reputation was built on finding truths others wanted buried. He lived in a modest office above a pawn shop, tucked away from the polished towers of the city. His blinds were always half closed, his ashtray always full, and his eyes, piercing, calculating, never missing a detail. Naomi walked in one rainy afternoon, her umbrella dripping with the weight of the storm outside. Raymond barely looked up from his desk when he asked, "Who sent you?" "No one," Naomi replied, her voice firm, though her hands betrayed a tremor. "I need help." She placed Marcus's phone on the table, open to the string of messages between him and Evelyn. Raymond finally leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He scrolled slowly, his silence cutting deeper than words. When he finally spoke, his tone was colder than the rain outside. "This isn't just an affair," he muttered. "This is a conspiracy." Naomi nodded, her chest tightening. "I need to know everything, who she is, where they go, what they're hiding. I want it all." Raymond studied her for a long moment, his gaze testing the strength behind her request. Then he leaned back, reached for a fresh notepad, and said, "It'll cost you, but if you want truth, you've come to the right man." And so, the investigation began. For weeks, Raymond followed Marcus and Evelyn's every step. He captured photographs, Marcus leaving late-night hotels, Evelyn handing over sealed envelopes, Candace appearing in the shadows, like a ghost being prepared to take center stage. Each image cut Naomi deeper, but it also hardened her resolve. She watched from Raymond's dimly lit office as the pictures piled higher, the truth becoming undeniable. Marcus hadn't just betrayed her with another woman, he had partnered with Evelyn to strip her of everything. Her home, her dignity, even her rightful inheritance from David's estate. But Naomi did not crumble. She did not weep as she once would have. Instead, she began to write. She filled a leather-bound journal with every piece of evidence, every detail Raymond uncovered. A ledger of betrayal, waiting for the day it would be revealed. The day when Marcus, Evelyn, and Candace would be forced to face the storm Naomi was preparing in silence. Naomi had learned enough to know the truth. Marcus and Evelyn thought they had erased her, but she understood something they did not. Silence was her weapon, and patience was her shield. Every night she sat alone at her desk, the leather-bound journal open before her, lit by a single lamp. Page after page, she filled with evidence Raymond unearthed. Names, dates, locations, pictures clipped and taped, phone records carefully transcribed. To an outsider it might look like obsession, but Naomi wasn't merely documenting betrayal. She was constructing a case, a snare so carefully woven that when it snapped shut, there would be no escape. But revenge, Naomi realized, could not be reckless. It had to be precise. To strike at Marcus and Evelyn, she needed to hit them where it hurt most: their reputation, their wealth, and their trust in each other. And so, she began the slow work of infiltration. The first step was subtle. She reached out to acquaintances, friends of David, business associates Marcus had underestimated. She played the grieving widow, her voice trembling just enough to stir sympathy. She asked quiet questions, dropped innocent remarks. And soon whispers began to spread. Whispers about Marcus's dealings, about Evelyn's unusual closeness, about Candace's sudden presence. The second step was financial. With Raymond's help, Naomi discovered accounts, hidden transfers, money moving silently from David's estate into Marcus's personal ventures. Documents Evelyn had signed off without hesitation. It wasn't just adultery, it was theft, and Naomi now had the paper trail to prove it. The third step was deception. Naomi started writing letters, anonymous letters, one addressed to a local journalist known for exposing corruption, another to a family friend who had once sat on the city council, and a third, carefully sealed, addressed to a law firm that handled estate fraud. She did not sign her name, but she included enough proof to light sparks. Naomi knew sparks could become flames. Meanwhile, Marcus and Evelyn continued their affair unchecked, oblivious to the net tightening around them. Marcus grew more arrogant, parading Evelyn in quiet corners of town. Evelyn, smug and untouchable, whispered promises to Candace, shaping her into the polished lady she envisioned as David's replacement. But neither of them noticed the changes in Naomi. When she passed them on the street, she no longer looked broken. Her posture was steady, her eyes sharp. Marcus dismissed it as survival. Evelyn dismissed it as weakness, masked by pride. But they were both wrong. Naomi wasn't surviving. She was preparing. And with every piece of evidence collected, every whisper seeded, every document filed in secret, she was building the very stage upon which Marcus and Evelyn would destroy themselves. The day of reckoning was no longer a question. It was inevitable. Whispers have a way of traveling faster than truth, and in Naomi's city, whispers about Marcus and Evelyn soon began to slither through corridors of power, into dinner tables, into Sunday pews. What had once been hidden in shadows was now a subject of cautious conversations, shared in lowered voices, eyes darting to ensure no one else was listening. The first crack appeared at a business luncheon. A colleague leaned close to Marcus, his tone polite, but his words laced with suspicion. "Strange transfers in the estate accounts," he remarked casually before excusing himself. Marcus laughed it off, but his fork clattered against his plate, betraying the unease in his hand. The second crack came when Evelyn attended a charity gala. She stepped into the room with her usual poise, her hand brushing against Marcus's arm. But as she mingled, she noticed the difference. Women she once commanded with her charm now turned their faces politely, avoiding her gaze. A senator's wife excused herself mid-conversation. The pastor's daughter greeted her with a brittle smile, then walked away without another word. Evelyn's stomach tightened. And then came the third crack, the most dangerous of all. An anonymous article appeared in the local paper. It hinted at financial fraud within the estate of the late David. It did not name names, but those who knew the family understood the implication. It was enough to cast doubt, enough to turn suspicion into quiet judgment. Evelyn stormed into Marcus's study the very next evening, waving the folded newspaper. Her voice shook with rage. "Did you see this? Someone's after us. Someone knows." Marcus dismissed her fears with arrogance. "It's just gossip. These things fade." But they did not fade. They grew. At Sunday service, Naomi sat quietly in the pews, her head bowed. She did not need to speak. She did not need to look at Marcus or Evelyn. She simply let the stares of others do the work for her. Parishioners shifted uncomfortably as Marcus entered. A few whispered. Some refused to shake his hand. Evelyn, once admired for her refinement, now felt the sting of isolation. Candace noticed too. Her once proud steps faltered as she realized the admiration she craved had soured into suspicion. Questions she could not answer followed her every move. She asked her mother what was happening, but Evelyn's responses were clipped, angry, and defensive. Candace's world, carefully built on her mother's lies, was starting to collapse. And Naomi watched it all unfold with the stillness of a hunter who knows her prey has entered the trap. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She only waited. Because Naomi understood something Evelyn never had. Destruction was not loud. It was quiet, gradual, invisible, until the very moment the final thread snapped. And when that moment came, Naomi intended for Marcus and Evelyn to feel the weight of every choice they had made. If you were Naomi, would you have struck already, or would you wait for the cracks to widen? Tell me in the comments, and if you're watching in silence without subscribing, let me warn you, when Naomi finally makes her move, you'll regret missing it. Subscribe now so you don't just hear the whispers, you witness the collapse. Every downfall begins with a tremor, and Naomi's first strike was subtle enough to look like chance, but sharp enough to leave scars. It began with the estate records. One morning, Marcus awoke to find an envelope slipped under his office door. Inside were photocopies of account transactions, transfers he himself had signed off under Evelyn's instructions. Money redirected, assets liquidated, names altered. The documents bore his signature. But there was something more, a single phrase scrawled at the bottom in an unfamiliar hand. Truth never dies. Marcus's face paled as he read. He locked his study door, fearing even Evelyn's eyes. But when she knocked, demanding to know why he hadn't come to breakfast, he burned the papers in the fireplace, watching the flames lick away the evidence. Yet the words haunted him. Truth never dies. Then came Evelyn's strike. Or rather, what she believed was a strike against Naomi. Evelyn arranged a luncheon with the church council, determined to reassert her influence. She dressed immaculately, her smile polished, her words rehearsed. But halfway through her speech about charity and family honor, one of the elders slid a small black folder across the table. Evelyn froze as she opened it. Inside were photographs, blurry but unmistakable, of Marcus meeting with a banker in secret. Large sums of money changing hands. The implication was devastating. "We thought you should see this," the elder murmured before excusing himself. Evelyn held the folder with trembling hands. Her credibility, her carefully constructed image, had just been poisoned. She excused herself from the luncheon, leaving behind whispers and sidelong glances. Meanwhile, Naomi walked the quiet streets of her neighborhood that evening, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She said nothing to anyone, but in her silence there was purpose. She had planted the seeds. Now they would grow. Candace, though still shielded by her mother, began to notice the unease. Her friends whispered questions she could not answer. "What's happening with your family? Why is everyone saying things about the estate?" She ran to Evelyn for reassurance, but Evelyn snapped at her, her patience fraying. Marcus, meanwhile, grew more reclusive, drinking late into the night, staring at empty walls, fearing the knock that might expose him. And Naomi? She was patient. This was not revenge delivered in fury. This was justice, sharpened by grief. She understood that Evelyn and Marcus thrived on power and reputation, so she had chosen the weapon that cut deepest, not the sword, but the whisper. Days later, Evelyn woke to find her mailbox stuffed with copies of that same anonymous note Marcus had received. Truth never dies. She tore them apart, shredding them into tiny pieces, but no matter how many she destroyed, more would come. Pinned to her door, slipped under her windshield, left on her church pew. It was no longer silence they feared. It was the steady voice of a truth they could not silence. For Naomi's hand was no longer hidden. It was invisible, yes, but undeniable, and Evelyn for the first time began to wonder if she was fighting something larger than just a stepdaughter's vengeance. Perhaps she was fighting against a truth she had spent her entire life trying to bury. Every war reaches a point when silence no longer protects, when the whispers in the dark echo too loudly to be ignored. For Evelyn and Marcus, that moment arrived on a gray morning, one that seemed ordinary to the world outside, but inside their estate, nothing was ordinary anymore. Marcus had grown restless, nights filled with drink, mornings haunted by ash from the burned papers he could never forget. He would stand by the window in his office, staring at the garden where Naomi once walked beside her husband, her laughter carried by the wind. Now it was silence that pressed against the glass, silence that suffocated. He couldn't confess to Evelyn, and he couldn't confess to himself, but guilt had a way of carving itself into his features. His once sharp posture slouched, his once firm voice trembled. Even Evelyn began to look at him with suspicion. Was her ally now her liability? Evelyn, meanwhile, was fighting her own invisible enemy. Every room she entered seemed filled with eyes. At church, women who once smiled now turned away. At the market, whispers followed her steps. She confronted Marcus one evening, slamming the black folder of photographs onto his desk. "What is this?" she hissed, her eyes burning. Marcus swore he had no answer, but the truth was written across his face, and Evelyn saw it. For the first time since her husband's death, Evelyn felt fear, not of Naomi, but of collapse. Her empire, her control, her name, each was beginning to rot. And while Evelyn raged, Naomi watched. Quiet, deliberate, unseen, she did not storm the gates. She loosened the foundations, brick by brick. The next strike came at the funeral home. A letter, unsigned, appeared in the director's office. It claimed Evelyn had forced Naomi out of her rightful place as a grieving widow. It detailed conversations, word for word, exposing Evelyn's cruelty. The director, fearing scandal, began to share his concerns with others. Within days, Evelyn's treatment of Naomi was no longer a hidden cruelty. It became a story whispered across town. Candace, young and unprepared for such storms, broke under the weight of it all. She cornered her mother in the kitchen one night, tears streaming. "Mama, why is everyone saying these things? Did you really push Naomi out? Did you lie about Daddy's wishes?" Evelyn slapped the question out of her daughter's mouth, but the damage was done. For even Candace, the one Evelyn had always controlled, was beginning to see cracks in her mother's mask. And then came the church service. Evelyn walked into the sanctuary, as she had always done, chin high, eyes forward. But that morning, no one rose to greet her, no hand extended, no smile offered. Even the pastor avoided her gaze. She sat down, her breath shallow, her pride aching. And as the choir sang, Evelyn realized something chilling. Her throne was gone. She was no longer feared. She was no longer respected. Meanwhile, Marcus reached his breaking point in a darker way. Alone in his study, he poured himself another glass of whiskey, his hands shaking. He opened the drawer where he had hidden the last anonymous note. "Truth never dies." He read it over and over, the words taunting him. Finally, in a drunken haze, he muttered, "If the truth never dies, then neither will the lie." But Marcus was wrong, for Naomi was patient, and she had yet to deliver the sharpest cut. Naomi's war had moved beyond whispers now. The stage was set. Her enemies had begun to collapse under the weight of their own sins. Their alliances were fractured. Their reputations were bleeding. Their household, once untouchable, was now fragile glass, ready to shatter at the slightest strike. And Naomi held the stone in her hand. But the question was, would she strike now, or wait until the silence broke them completely? Naomi had waited long enough. The silence had done its work, carving fractures in the house of Evelyn and Marcus. Now it was time to let the world see what the shadows had already revealed. Her first move was not with words, but with presence. After weeks of whispers and veiled messages, Naomi appeared, uninvited, at a town charity gala, one Evelyn herself had sponsored. The hall was drenched in golden light, laughter echoing through chandeliers, a night designed to remind the town of Evelyn's dominance. But when Naomi walked in, dressed in simple black satin, a hush fell across the room. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned, and in that silence, Evelyn's carefully built illusion crumbled. Evelyn froze where she stood, her champagne glass trembling. For the first time since the funeral, she was face to face with Naomi. No words were spoken, none needed to be. The very fact that Naomi stood there, uninvited, unashamed, was louder than thunder. The whispers began almost instantly. That's Naomi, isn't it? The widow. Didn't Evelyn push her away? What is she doing here? Naomi moved through the crowd with grace, each step a reminder that she belonged, that this was her circle as much as Evelyn's. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, she simply existed, and in doing so she exposed Evelyn as the liar she was. Marcus, drunk and weary, could not bear it. He left the gala early, locking himself in his car, staring at his shaking hands on the steering wheel. Guilt had worn him down to the bone. Seeing Naomi reminded him of the oath he had broken, the truth he had buried. And though he tried to drown it in whiskey, the image of Naomi, alive, strong, unbroken, haunted him. Evelyn, however, raged. That night, when she returned home, she tore apart her dressing table, smashing bottles of perfume, ripping photographs in half. She swore she would not be humiliated again. She summoned Marcus to her side, demanding a plan, demanding silence. But Marcus gave her none. He sat slouched in the chair, staring blankly at the wall, muttering, "It's over. It's already over." The betrayal burned deeper when Evelyn noticed her daughter, Candace, watching from the hallway. Candace's face was pale, her eyes wide, not with loyalty to her mother, but with sympathy for Naomi. The younger woman had begun to see Naomi not as an intruder, but as the rightful widow. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something terrifying. She was losing her grip on everyone. Days later, the inevitable happened. Naomi made her presence undeniable at the place Evelyn thought she still ruled, the church. Sunday morning, the pews were full, sunlight streaming through stained glass. Evelyn entered as always, chin raised, expecting to command the room, but then the doors opened again and Naomi walked in. This time, she did not sit in the back. She walked all the way to the front pew, the pew where Evelyn once sat with her husband. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The pastor faltered in his sermon. Evelyn's throat tightened. Naomi didn't look at Evelyn. She simply sat, her hands folded, her eyes forward. But her presence spoke volumes. "I am still here. You tried to erase me, but I will not vanish." And when the final hymn ended, Naomi stood, turned, and faced the congregation. She didn't need to speak. The people had already chosen sides. Some avoided Evelyn's gaze, others whispered Naomi's name like a prayer. Evelyn had lost control. Her kingdom was slipping. Naomi had stepped out of the shadows. But the war was not over. It was only beginning. Because Naomi's final move was not simply to reclaim her place. It was to make Evelyn pay for every humiliation, every wound, every cruel word. And that retribution was coming. Evelyn had always believed Naomi's strength was tied to her silence. She thought that by casting Naomi out, she had buried her forever. But Naomi was not buried. She was sharpened. Every sleepless night, every whispered insult, every tear shed in the dark had honed her into something stronger than Evelyn could comprehend. And now, she was ready to strike. Naomi's first move was legal. Evelyn had always prided herself on the iron grip she held over the estate, flaunting it as her personal throne. But Naomi had something Evelyn didn't, a rightful claim. The will of Naomi's late husband had been altered in Evelyn's favor under suspicious circumstances. Naomi knew it, Marcus knew it, and the town, though silent, had always whispered it. Quietly, Naomi met with lawyers. She didn't storm in with accusations. She came armed with documents, old records Evelyn thought were destroyed, hidden copies Naomi had kept safe for years. Piece by piece, she reconstructed the truth. The land, the businesses, the wealth. It was never meant to be Evelyn's. And when Naomi's petition hit the court, Evelyn's name was dragged into the open, no longer a queen, but a thief under scrutiny. Evelyn panicked. She paced her halls like a caged animal, demanding Marcus fight alongside her. But Marcus, hollowed by guilt, refused. His eyes, once sharp with calculation, were dull now. He barely lifted his head when Evelyn screamed, "You did this! she shouted, clawing at him, but Marcus only whispered, "No, you did." The second move was social. Naomi didn't hide anymore. She walked freely through the market, through the streets, and wherever she went, the people gravitated to her. Old neighbors, once too afraid to speak, now stopped to greet her, offering hands, offering smiles. Children whispered her name. Shopkeepers refused Evelyn's money, pretending their tills were full, yet bowing when Naomi passed by. The people had chosen their widow. Evelyn had become the outcast. But Naomi's most devastating move came when Evelyn least expected it. The annual business council meeting, an event Evelyn had chaired for years, was supposed to be her last bastion of power. She dressed in her finest silks, her jewels heavy on her throat, prepared to remind them all that she was still in control. But when she arrived, her seat at the head of the table was already taken. Naomi sat there, calm, elegant, her hands folded over a neat stack of papers. The silence in the room was deafening. Evelyn's voice cracked as she demanded Naomi leave, but the council chairman cleared his throat, reading aloud the new court ruling. Naomi was the rightful shareholder. Evelyn no longer had authority. The gasp that followed cut Evelyn deeper than any blade. She staggered, her fingers clutching at the chair, but no one moved to help her. Not Marcus, not Candace, not even the allies who once swore loyalty. They looked past her, their eyes fixed on Naomi. Naomi didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She only leaned forward and spoke softly, "I am not here for revenge, I am here for justice, but justice has a way of revealing what revenge hides." And with those words the room belonged to her. Evelyn, stripped of title, stripped of power, stumbled out into the night. The trap was tightening. For Evelyn there was no longer anywhere to run. Her wealth was fading. Her daughter was slipping away. Her reputation was ashes. Naomi had not yet delivered the final blow, but it was coming, and Evelyn knew it. Every breath, every sleepless hour was now poisoned by the dread of what Naomi's next move would be. Because when a woman returns from the grave of humiliation, she does not stop halfway. She finishes what was begun, and Naomi was far from finished. Viewers, if you were Naomi, would you stop here, content with reclaiming your rights? Or would you destroy Evelyn completely to make her feel every ounce of suffering she caused? Comment below. And if you're watching without subscribing, think about this. Evelyn thought silence would save her, and look where it left her. Don't be silent. Subscribe now, and let your voice be heard. Evelyn had always believed ruin would never touch her. She believed money, status, and fear made her untouchable. But when a storm gathers long enough, it does not strike gently. It destroys. Naomi's patience had run its course. She had taken back the name that Evelyn tried to erase, reclaimed the wealth Evelyn tried to bury, and restored the dignity Evelyn tried to destroy. But one thing remained unfinished: the truth. The truth Evelyn had buried beneath lies, whispered rumors, and forged signatures. The town's annual memorial for Naomi's late husband was the perfect stage. It was a gathering Evelyn had long used as her throne, parading her widow's black while Naomi sat hidden in the shadows. But not this year. This year, Naomi walked into the hall dressed in radiant white, not as the forgotten wife, but as the true widow. The crowd parted for her like waves bowing to the tide. Evelyn froze when she saw her. She had prepared another performance, another speech dripping with false grief. But before Evelyn could speak, Naomi stepped onto the stage, her voice clear, her gaze steady. She held up documents signed by her late husband, Evelyn's secret dealings exposed line by line: business theft, manipulation of accounts, fraudulent claims. Evelyn's name was smeared across every page. The murmurs in the hall rose into a storm of gasps, whispers, and condemnation. "You claimed to honor him," Naomi said, her voice steady, "but you desecrated his memory for your own gain. Today, his name is freed from your lies." Evelyn's knees buckled. Candace rushed to hold her, but even her daughter's touch could not steady her anymore. Marcus hid his face in his hands, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. The empire Evelyn built on deceit crumbled before everyone's gaze. Then Naomi delivered the blow Evelyn never expected. With deliberate calm, she announced that part of her restored wealth would go into a foundation, not for herself, but for the poor, the widows, and the fatherless, the very people Evelyn had despised. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for Naomi's generosity, but for her strength. Evelyn was no longer a queen. She was a cautionary tale, standing trembling in the ruins of her pride. And as Naomi descended from the stage, she paused before Evelyn. Their eyes locked. Evelyn searched Naomi's face for hatred, for rage, for cruelty. But Naomi's expression was something worse, mercy. "You tried to bury me," Naomi whispered, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "But I was not a seed to be crushed. I was a seed meant to rise." Those words shattered Evelyn more than the documents, more than the applause, more than the fall of her fortune. Because for the first time in her life, Evelyn understood. Naomi had won not by becoming her, but by rising above her. Evelyn staggered out of the hall, stripped of her throne, abandoned by her allies, haunted by her own reflection. Naomi, meanwhile, walked into the light, her head high, her dignity unbroken, her story rewritten in justice. The final blow was not destruction, it was transformation, and Evelyn would spend the rest of her days living in the shadow of the woman she tried to erase and failed. Silence. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed after the storm broke. The phone that once rang endlessly with invitations, business proposals, and social engagements now sat lifeless on her desk. No one called. No one visited. The silence pressed in on her, heavier than any insult she had ever endured. She sat in her grand living room, curtains drawn, her glass of wine untouched, listening to the echo of her own breathing. For the first time in years, Evelyn was alone. Marcus's downfall had been swift. His colleagues abandoned him, distancing themselves to protect their reputations. Lawsuits followed, creditors circled, and soon the man who once boasted of power could no longer afford to keep the very house he used to parade in. He wandered through the empty halls with bitterness in his chest, muttering about betrayal, unable to comprehend how quickly loyalty evaporated when truth came to light. And Candace, the daughter who had laughed at Naomi's pain, who had believed herself untouchable, now walked through town under a different gaze. Friends avoided her. Employers dismissed her applications. She felt eyes on her back everywhere she went, eyes that carried not admiration, but pity and scorn. The reflection in the mirror showed her someone she did not recognize, a girl stripped of illusions, grasping for a sense of belonging that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Naomi's life shifted quietly but profoundly. She did not celebrate with loud declarations, nor did she seek public applause. She rose each morning with a calm dignity, her days filled with purpose once stolen from her. She met with lawyers, finalized the estate papers, and restructured what was rightfully hers. She visited David's grave, standing with flowers in her hands, whispering promises that justice had been delivered. But Naomi was no fool. She knew that vengeance did not erase grief. It did not return the years taken from her, nor mend the wounds carved deep into her spirit. Yet it restored something equally powerful: her voice, her name, her place in a world that had tried to erase her. The community noticed, too. Where Evelyn once held sway, Naomi now stood. People greeted her with warmth at church, neighbors stopped to talk with her on the street, and whispers that had once carried doubt now carried respect. Naomi had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so she left Evelyn trapped in them. But Evelyn could not accept defeat. She sat night after night in that suffocating silence, her eyes burning with resentment. She replayed the funeral in her mind, the day she had cast Naomi out, the day she thought she had won. And every time, her chest ached with the memory of the moment Naomi returned, not broken, but unshaken. Evelyn could not forgive the humiliation, and so, even in her ruin, Evelyn whispered to herself a vow that one day, somehow, she would rise again. But Naomi had already learned, the deadliest enemies are not those who fight in the open, but those who watch in silence, waiting for their moment. For now, Naomi held the power. But somewhere in the shadows, Evelyn's eyes still burned with the hunger of a woman who had lost everything and who had nothing left to lose. Viewers, let me ask you, if you were Naomi, would you rest knowing Evelyn is finished, or would you fear her silent vow in the dark? Comment your answer. And if you're watching without subscribing, remember, those who ignore warnings are often the first to fall when the shadows return. Hit subscribe so you never miss how far this story will go. Evelyn could not sleep. The nights stretched on like an endless punishment, each hour heavier than the last. The once proud matriarch now wandered through her dimly lit home, clutching at old photo frames, staring at faces that reminded her of what she had lost. Her wealth, gone. Her status, shattered. Her control, broken. But one thought clung to her like a lifeline. Naomi had taken everything. And if Naomi could rise from ashes, Evelyn told herself, then so could she. It began small. A letter slid under Naomi's door one morning. No name, no address, just a single line scrawled in sharp handwriting. "You don't belong here." Naomi read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer without a word. The next week, a vase Naomi had placed at David's grave was shattered, the flowers ripped apart. Naomi returned to find the soil disturbed, as though someone had trampled over her offering. She stood still, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing tightly together. And then came the whispers. Strangers approaching Naomi with strange questions. Did you really marry David for love? Or, they say you tricked him into changing the will. Rumors Evelyn had planted, quietly, carefully, with the precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Naomi's friends reassured her. The community trusted her. But in the silence of her own room, Naomi felt the weight of it pressing down. Evelyn's shadow had not disappeared. It had only changed shape. Late one evening, Naomi stepped outside onto her porch. The air was cold, the street quiet, the moon half hidden by clouds. And there, at the edge of the road, stood a figure, unmoving, watching. Naomi did not flinch. She recognized the stance, the outline of Evelyn's posture, the stubborn tilt of her chin. They stared at one another across the silence, two women bound by grief, vengeance, and pride. Neither spoke, neither moved. The night itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, as quietly as she had appeared, Evelyn turned and vanished into the darkness. For Naomi, it was confirmation. The war was not over. The courtroom had closed its doors. The papers had been signed. The estate had been settled. But Evelyn still lingered, determined to strike in ways the law could not touch. But Naomi was no longer the broken widow cast out after a funeral. She was stronger now, sharper, and unwilling to bow ever again. If Evelyn was waiting for weakness, she would wait in vain. Still, a question remained. How far was Evelyn willing to go, now that she had lost everything? And what price was Naomi prepared to pay to protect the life she had reclaimed? Naomi could no longer ignore it. Evelyn's shadow wasn't fading. It was tightening, circling, pressing against the edges of her new life. One morning, Naomi stood in the marketplace, arranging baskets of fruit for the community charity she had built. Her hands moved carefully, her face calm, but inside she felt it again. That presence. She lifted her eyes, and there she was. Evelyn, across the square, watching. Their eyes locked, and this time neither woman looked away. Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady. "If you have something to say, Evelyn, say it to me. Stop hiding in whispers." Evelyn's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something cold. "You stole everything, Naomi, everything that was mine. And you expect me to vanish quietly? No, I will remind everyone who you truly are." The words cut through the air like a blade. People turned, listening. Naomi inhaled deeply, her voice strong yet controlled. "I didn't steal, Evelyn. David loved me. You treated me like an intruder from the first day, but I was his wife. I was at his side until the end. That's something you can never erase." The crowd murmured. Evelyn's face flushed, her control faltering. For the first time, the once untouchable stepmother looked small, cornered, trembling with rage she could no longer mask. But Evelyn was not done. That evening she arrived at Naomi's doorstep. No audience, no crowd, just the two of them, under the heavy silence of night. She knocked once, firmly. Naomi opened the door, already expecting her. They stood face to face, two women bound by love for the same man, by grief that had taken different shapes, by a war neither had chosen, but both were determined to win. Evelyn's voice was low, almost shaking. "Do you really believe you've won? Do you think his spirit rests easily with you holding his name, his home, his legacy?" Naomi did not flinch. "I believe he rests because he knew I loved him, because he knew I stayed true until his last breath. You can hate me for that, Evelyn. You can fight me. But what you cannot do is change the truth." The silence between them was heavy, sharp, unbroken. Evelyn's eyes glistened, not only with hatred but with grief, with the weight of years she could not undo. For a fleeting moment, Naomi saw it, the woman behind the cruelty. A widow who had lost her place, who had never learned how to live without control. But then Evelyn stepped back, her face hardening again. "This isn't finished," she whispered. "As long as I breathe, it will never be finished." And with that, she turned and walked away into the night, her figure swallowed by darkness. Naomi stood in the doorway long after, her heart steady but heavy. She knew Evelyn's war was not about money anymore. It was about pride, about identity, about refusing to let go. And that made her far more dangerous than before. Viewers, if you were Naomi, would you have let Evelyn inside to speak? Or would you have closed the door the moment she knocked? Tell me in the comments. And if you're hearing this and haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, how many warnings can you ignore before you find yourself unprepared? Subscribe now, so you never miss how these stories unfold. Naomi closed the door that night, the echo of Evelyn's footsteps fading into the distance. Yet the silence that followed did not bring peace. It brought weight. The kind of weight that does not lift easily, the kind that lingers in the corners of a room even when the house is quiet. Evelyn was gone, but her shadow remained. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows, Naomi felt it. That reminder that battles with the living often end only in death, but battles with the heart never truly end. And so, Naomi carried on. She walked through the same village where she had once been humiliated, now greeted with respect, with cautious admiration. Yet she knew that her story was not one of victory or defeat. It was a story of survival, of standing tall in the face of relentless opposition. But Evelyn's final words whispered through her memory like a curse. "As long as I breathe, it will never be finished." And Naomi could not help but wonder, was that a threat or a prophecy? Viewers, do you believe Naomi has truly escaped Evelyn's grasp? Or has Evelyn only stepped into the shadows, waiting for her chance to strike again? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and before you leave, think carefully. Those who walk away without subscribing often forget the lessons hidden in these stories. Don't be one of them. Subscribe now and stay awake to the truths others ignore. And so, Naomi's chapter, at least for now, draws to a close. Her fight was not only against Evelyn, but against the weight of injustice, against betrayal, and against the silent walls that tried to shut her out. Yet through every tear, every whispered humiliation, every night when it seemed easier to give up, she endured. Her story reminds us that sometimes the cruelest battles are fought in our own homes, with those who carry the same name, share the same roof, or claim to love us. And when those battles come, it is not strength alone that carries us. It is courage. To you, watching until this very moment, I want to say thank you. You could have clicked away, you could have left Naomi's voice unheard, but you stayed. You listened. And that matters more than you know. But remember this, Naomi's story is not only hers, it is a mirror. Somewhere, someone watching right now has faced a stepmother like Evelyn, a betrayal from within the family, a silence after the funeral when the people you expected to protect you turned their backs instead. If that is you, then this story was yours as much as hers. So I thank you for giving her pain meaning, for giving her survival weight. Because every time you watch, comment, and share, you remind the world that these stories should not be forgotten. But before you leave, I must leave you with a warning. Do not carry Naomi's lesson in silence. Too many walk away unchanged. Too many turn off the screen and pretend life is normal. If you do that, then you let Evelyn win. You let every betrayer, every manipulator, every deceiver slip back into the shadows unchallenged. Do not let that happen. Subscribe now, not just for more stories, but to stand with those who refuse to be silenced. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from? Your words are not just words. They are proof that you too chose to see the truth instead of turning away. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And until we meet again in the next story, remember, silence protects the oppressor, but your voice, your presence, keeps the fire alive.